Welcome back to another edition of Talking Chi. I'm Javi. I'm here with my co-host, Nona, and our guest, Abaliene. And this is a show about Tai Chi, Qigong, movement, internalizing, the journey of body and mind and soul, and interfacing with the external world. If everything is made of energy, then we have a lot to discuss. Did I miss anything there?
No, sounds about right.
We're with a local. I just found out Abaliene were you born and raised here in Southern Humboldt?
I was.
Okay.
Yeah. I grew up here. I was born here on Pratt Mountain, so that's up Alder Point Road.
Okay.
And I've, went to school here, both Redway and South Fork, and met my husband here, who's also born and raised here. And we have a son that is living here now and going to school here in the community. So.
Excellent. So I think today we are talking about spinal care. So tell us about your business, your offerings, how you got into that, and then, what it is you offer, and a little bit about your journey, with that.
Okay. So my business is called Abaliene Integrative Spinal Care, and I like to think of it as the spine is the center of us. We have, it starts at our brain, and we have our central nervous system that travels down and then kind of goes out from there. It creates movement. We can essentially live without limbs, but we can't really live without a spine or move very well without it. So I call it integrative spinal care because everything kind of ties around that. We need that good movement of breath, of limbs in order to keep a healthy spine and keep us out of back pain, because really I think the statistics say that about 80% of people in their lifetime will suffer from back pain at some point in time.
Wow. I just did a recent show on pain. I think 1 in 5 people suffers from chronic pain, not necessarily in the back, but throughout the body. How did you get into? Tell us about your spinal journey.
Okay. I guess in some ways you could say that it started when I was 13. So when you're in junior high, you get a scoliosis test.
Okay.
And so I was, diagnosed with scoliosis. So that just means that your spine curves to the side. All spines should have a natural curvature, a kyphosis and a lower dosis.
Yeah. The chi is the top and the lower is the bottom. Okay,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then we also have a sacral curve, and then
right.
and we also have a cervical curve at the neck as well. So
nice.
It kind of does this nice little snaking. So from there, so after being diagnosed, my parents took me to
13, you said?
13, yeah. Okay. So I, went to the doctor, and then I went to a chiropractor, and they said, do these stretches, do these exercises. I did them. But then, I think, life goes on. That's no big deal. It wasn't painful for me. It wasn't very severe. I didn't have to worry about it. So then just going through life, you find yourself on your health journey, right? You find out things that work for you, things that don't, maybe eating a certain food works, maybe it doesn't, right? So, fast forward after having my son. So I was around 30, so kind of late for having a child. And that was a little bit labor intensive, pun intended.
Mm-hmm.
And he sat to my left side. So looking back now, I know that was my scoliosis popping up. My body had shifted all of my weight to my left. Mm. And that's where it was very comfortable for him to sit. So babies really ideally need to be centrally aligned in order to come out and have an easy transition into this world. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of maybe a clue that I didn't pick up on. So probably fast forward another, say, 6 years or so. And I'm finally feeling like, okay, my son is old enough. I can start pursuing other things what do I really want to do? I was done working for other people and kind of just wanted to do something for myself. So I heard about the Chek system and Paul Chek, and I don't know if you have heard of him at all.
It sounds familiar.
He really likes, Tai Chi and Qigong,
Okay.
and that's a big part of his practice too. And it's a very, what I loved so much about it was a holistic approach.
Okay.
So Chek is created from Paul Chek, and so it stands for Corrective Holistic Exercise and Kinesiology.
Nice.
And so, of course, the study of movement is a big part, of course, is kinesiology. And then the holistic part is we like to try and incorporate and look at a person as a whole, right? It's not just your physical body, it's your emotional state and what you're eating and your all the components that make us who we are. And so after hearing an interview with him, he had offered some free classes. So you just kind of take little bites, right? You're like, oh, I like this. And then I like more of it, and I like more. And so you just kind of dive deeper down into that rabbit hole of all those amazing things, right? Like, oh, this is so cool. And I love all the scientific tests, right? So there was a component of holistic health coaching that I think is important too, right? Just diet, lifestyle, those kind of things, eating, sleeping, drinking well. And then there's the scientific testing part, which is what I largely do at my office in Garberville. And that is where I measure people's posture. And so I measure their spinal curves. I measure, how is your range of motion in your arms? How is your range of motion in your hips? Because hips are a really big one and very closely related to back pain. Because most of us don't really sit on the floor anymore or move as well as we should. We kind of stop at 90 degrees and sit in chairs. When we can't move our hips well enough and in a full range of motion, then our back has to do that extra work and articulate more, which is why we see that prevalence of the 80% of people having the back pain.
So 80% is from actually hip issues and lack of usage and range of motion and strength and flexibility, maybe.
Well, I think that it's kind of debatable. That's the interesting thing about people is, I would say that a large percent of it would be from hip pain, but there's always confounding factors that you never really know. It could be because someone has too far forward of head posture or their kyphosis is super extreme. The pelvis, because we're always seeking central alignment with the horizon and with gravity, we are constantly morphing our bodies in order to gain that balance and that equilibrium. So sometimes it might be a scoliosis. Sometimes it might be a kyphosis in which someone has maybe a Dowager's hump or something extreme like that you've seen. And, other times it's a posterior pelvic tilt and someone lacks a butt. Like I know that we've all seen, men around town that their pants are always falling down because they have no butt.
Yeah.
Things like that are all just really, factors that have to be kind of considered in when doing an assessment with someone, because we are each an individual and different. Otherwise it would be a pretty easy fix.
Wow, yeah. So when you say that, I was wondering about hip mobility. You say you measure hip mobility. What is hip mobility? What does healthy hip mobility look like?
Okay, so there is a range of motion. So we have flexion and extension, right?
So flexion is extending. Oh, no, sorry. Extension is extending. Flexion is...
Yeah, so it would be, I'm flexing the hip when I pick up my leg to walk, and then I extend it when I go back.
Okay. Yeah,
and then we have
flexion. Yes.
Exactly.
So opening, maybe closing.
Exactly. Taking
extending, contracting, expanding, contracting.
So that's just one area. So
Okay.
then we have abduction and
Yep.
adduction.
Right.
So out to the side and in towards the midline.
Gotcha.
Are the easier ways to say that. And then you have internal and external rotation. So toeing in
Yep.
versus toeing out.
Great.
And all of those muscles have a connection both up and down the chain.
From like toe to hip or something, and even farther.
Yeah.
Okay. The chain.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's kind of like that kid song, right?
Yeah.
The head bone's connected to the neck bone's connected to the arm bone.
Right.
They're all interconnected, so they all play off each other, especially because they are all working off of the same neural network.
The spinal central nervous system.
Exactly.
Okay.
You hear a lot of overlap with our what we've been studying, and how the hips and the back are so interrelated in our practice. So in our movement practice, we're always well, maybe Javi, you want to talk about the spine wave?
Well, I'm just thinking about like the hips. I'm thinking about the core, the dantian, and moving from center. In our classes, we've been talking about moving from center. This sort of Western concept that we know of, like moving from center. In our Tai Chi ball exercises, we talk about the internal ball, which is kind of referring to the internal core, the dantian, the gut system, and how it transfers to the hands, arms, eventually fingers, and that's your central connection when you're doing movement, whether it's from the legs or arms, and always searching for what we call a body structure, where it's like an integrated full body movement. But the spine is, this is so interesting. The spine is, or the spinal wave is the first thing that like we were taught when we started doing Tai Chi Qigong. And it's like the first move that we teach people, because it's the largest, what we call bow. So we have two arm bows, two leg bows that we call, and the spine bow that we open and close, or we extend and contract, or ascend and descend, depending on the move. And then we have like a chest bow that does this. It opens and closes, And so the spinal wave is what we teach folks for a number of reasons. One, soften, lubricate. So a number of things to move with correct body structure or efficiency, and with alignment, and find the alignment. So we work on moving the spine like a wave, just in a cycle. So there's this like yin yang aspect to it, of ascending, descending, expanding, contracting, and it's cyclical. In a way, it's like one movement, but it's also two, because you're ascending and descending, and you want to try to facilitate a flow and keep. So what this does is, for the spine health, is lubricate the joints, soften the connective tissues around the spine, pump cerebral spinal fluid, into the brain, and then also just, I would say, internally, connect one to one center, and embody, sort of the mind, bring back the mind into the body, if you will. And so those movements then extend, once we have that, it always builds and deepens, but when we have that, then we can start to move the legs and move the hands and arms. So that's the spine wave for all of the movements that we do. So if someone masters like the spine wave, then they can eventually do all the movements that we do that are just like in Tai Chi and in Kung Fu. Obviously it's the core and the center. So that's a central, component. So that's the spinal wave. Did I miss anything?
Very good. There's a lot to it. And I think it's the most interesting action when a beginner starts to engage with it, because people don't normally articulate their spines. And you mentioned the lack of range of motion and awareness, and our sedentary lifestyle where we're always just sitting. And, our teacher talks about how that has been the downfall of, our health, is that sitting lifestyle. And um, I'm interested to know, you're talking about approaching it from a holistic health, measuring the spine. So once you've kind of looked at people's spines, where do you take them from there?
It really depends on the person. So another thing that I think is important to take into account, that there's, two, say, polar differences where some people are hypermobile and some people are hypomobile. So some people are say stiff, right? That's hypomobile. Hard time moving. And then you have sometimes those pretzel people who can, get their palms flat and their, all of their joints are just super bendy and easy to manipulate. And so depending on which type of person you are, you kind of have to take a different approach. Someone who tends to be hypermobile and really bendy, it's really important not to do more stretching for them. It's really important to strengthen so that you're not getting any more torsion on their joints. Someone who is hypomobile, it's really important to get those joints and ligaments stretching. And moving. And so then I guess that's where the fun and the art comes in for me, right? Is to pick apart the person a little bit, like what you like, what don't you like, what do you do, how do you move, how don't you move, because often the problems arise from repetitive motion, right? Someone, most of us are very forward people. We hug in front of us, we work in front of us, we pull and carry in front of us. And so often, opening the chest is really important. And maybe some people need to do that through more movement. Some people need to do that through more stretching. But I typically like to give people both, stretching exercises, trigger point release exercises, and then movements to do with that as well. So depending on the modality that they choose, whether it's weight or whether it's not. But I tend to be more on the restorative end of things, because most people, unfortunately, are doing things improperly without knowing it, just overutilizing certain muscle groups that they shouldn't be.
So I would say that, as you said, the injury or pain would come from repetition. And then like you said, lack of the only thing that comes to mind is like movement intelligence, or just basic know-how, the postural alignment and whatnot. We all say like lift with our legs, but do we do it? So, and then I was thinking that the pain and injuries and whatnot also come from lack of diversity of movement. But really I'm thinking it's like, why do we not know how to move through the world? Why are we not taught how to move through the world? This is always something that I'm always coming back to. It's like we are all, given these bodies, and yet we are required to do all these things as a human, in the home, outside the home, in the community, outside the community, with these bodies, and yet no one teaches us how to use them in proper ways. And if you want to know, you really have to seek it out and for yourself and become this sort of like lifelong student,
Yeah, I think that's a sad thing, because we have physical education, right? We have PE, but I don't think that's much. Most of the time it's playing games, which is one of the best ways, right, for us all to learn how to move. But again, I think it's the Western lifestyle, right? Like when we start going to school, we sit in a desk And, we are just always at 90 degrees. We're not sitting on the floor and having to get comfortable and move because we're sitting cross-legged and then we're uncomfortable. So then maybe we go to our elbows and that gets uncomfortable. So then we switch and then we switch and then we switch. Mm-hmm. And it goes from there where now we drive everywhere. We don't have to walk somewhere or,
mm-hmm. This is what our teacher says too. He's like, you kind of alluded to this when you were saying that, we carry things in front of us and we hug in front of us. We basically evolved with these bodies over time based on the things that we were doing throughout the day, walking, we've got these muscles on our legs, the largest muscles, the buttocks and, mm-hmm. Just to walk and cover large distances, the biceps and the curling to carry and hold. And then obviously the back. Forget where I was going with that. But that's what you kind of alluded to, is like we've evolved and the bodies have evolved based on our functions and what we do. And in a way, we no longer do a lot of those things that we did in the past. Like you said, our lifestyle is in the car. That's what our teacher says. He's like, in the car, out the car, in the car, out the car, walking on, flat surfaces, which doesn't do well for like our ankles and calves, knees and whatnot, in terms of like giving the joints the diversity that in a way keeps them healthy. And a lot of times we, I guess, probably towards the later years, get more scared to do things and restrict ourselves, which doesn't fare well. And also so it's also like this balance of interfacing with your range of motion, maybe trying to expand it at the same time. You're also aging too, and in a way your abilities are deteriorating.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a move it or lose it kind of a situation, which is kind of a sad saying. But the other thing I think is important to point out is shoe wearing. I'm a fan of going barefoot as much as I possibly can. And proprioception is just so important to get that feedback of our terrain. What are we walking on? How does our body need to adapt as we are walking across things? One of my favorite things to do in the summer is rock hopping in a creek with my son. And I just love that. It's like there's so much negotiating that has to happen. Is it slippery? Is it a big one? Is it a little one? Do I step with the right foot or the left foot? How do I go about this? Do I need to help stabilize with my hands? What's going on here? Do I need to squat, bend, hop? How does it work?
Weight distribution, weight transfer, like extending and exploding, how much energy to give to, and then also the eye coordination and your distance. So like the depth perception as well. Yeah. Use it or lose it. We definitely agree with that.
What a great way to train, in the creek in the summer, jumping from rock to rock. That sounds like great training for the body, integrating into life. And we talk about, how your body adapts to the conditions you give it. So you are creating the environment for your body. So the daily tasks and the requirements that you give to it, your bodies are going to adjust. And I think you mentioned earlier that our body's recreating itself all the time. And so, as you change what you are asking of your body, you're changing the environment, so to speak, that your tissues have to adapt to. And so it sounds like, over time, you're asking your clients to change the daily encounters that the body makes with the outside world, whether or not it's from something real like jumping from rock to rock, or you consciously say, you know what, I'm going to take my shoulders back and open that chest and create a different curvature for my spine. So I'd like to maybe ask what you do with clients, as far as you give them something to work with, they go and they come back and they talk with you again. Is that, do you have more of a long standing relationship? Obviously change doesn't happen. It's not like you're prescribing surgery or, something like that. It's a slow kind of process. What does that look like for you?
So the first 2 appointments are an hour and a half each, and they are just testing, and that's a lot of testing, 3 hours worth. But it really gives me a way to measure them both statically and dynamically. And that kind of gives me a head-to-toe picture. How's everything working within that system? How do we compensate when maybe you broke your knee 20 years ago and it was fine, but then your shoulder has to help compensate for that limp, or your hip or your neck? So I kind of like to try and tie it all together. From there, I create a program, right? Stretching and exercises. And then I typically will see a client. And I love to see them as much as possible. Finances are always an issue for people. It's how much can you afford to come back? But the re-education system is just so important, because it's mostly dealing with faulty movements. That you're trying to correct. You're trying to help someone with that internal rotation or external rotation of the hip, potentially. And so they're unconsciously moving it. So maybe, say, you bend over and your knees collapse together. You're lacking that rotation and stability within your glute or butt complex in order to stabilize yourself. So your back has to adapt to that change. So ideally, you would see someone for a long period of time and continuously change that stimulus. You'd be working on, say, strengthening those internal rotation muscles, but you would be doing it over several months. Because our bodies do adapt really quickly and create those changes, but they also are lazy. They want to create a really quick neural pathway and be done with it and catalog it away and be like, okay, I've got that done. So you have to continuously give it a new stimulus and say, okay, we're working the same muscle, but a little bit differently. So you keep throwing it new bones, which is a little hard, right? Because I think there is a biological imperative to create a programming system so it's just filed away, which is why we can ride a bike, right? It's just like getting back on a bike. You know how to do it because you did it when you were 5 as a kid. So I have had clients that have worked with me for years, and I have had clients that have been like, okay, I'm good, thank you, and I'm fixed and I'm done. And so hopefully that answers your question in terms of how long to work with someone or what it looks like.
Yeah, it's definitely sounds like you're there for their journey, and that's something that's part of the process, is that you're there to coach them through all those little changes and provide that diversity for them along the way. And that sounds well supported. I'm curious, I want to go back to what you mentioned, that the founder of the modality that you studied had an interest in Tai Chi. And I had a question as to, what did you learn through the program at all, if any, Tai Chi principles, or how do you might integrate that into your approach?
Oh, that's a good question. So he has this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 system that I think has a lot to do with Tai Chi. So it's one love. What is your one love? What is your goal or your dream? And that helps create a scope for all of us to focus and drive towards. And then you have the yin and the yang, right, from there. So that's the 2. We have our light and our dark, and how do we balance those within ourselves, and what is going on spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, that we can help balance that. And then there's the 3 choices. And so that is, do we take the higher choice? Do we take the lesser choice? Or do we just kind of stay neutral? And sometimes those things all apply, right? Like maybe you have a bad habit that you're trying to kick and you just can't. So you're choosing the suboptimal choice, but that's not getting you very far. Other times maybe you're in a fight with someone, right? And you the best place to be is just not make a decision right now and stay neutral. And then other times you take the higher road. Oh yes, I'm going to remember to consider my partner when making those choices, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the 4 doctors, and it's Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, Dr. Happiness, and Dr. Movement. And that's kind of taken from Hippocrates, and so those can be divided into the yin and the yang, and just analyzing ourselves, right, in terms of how can we balance those things out more, right? Do I need more happiness? Do I need more movement in my life? Or do I need less? Because in some ways there's a lot of people that are super high stress these days, right? Where it's like sometimes you need more of that Dr. Quiet and, eating better food. When you're stressed out, sometimes you eat all that crappy stuff. But in terms of movement, of Tai Chi movements, there were a few when I went down for the to San Diego, to the workshop there. And they did teach us some, and I'm terrible with
Chinese names.
Yeah, but where you have a split stance and you're just moving that ball of energy, right, that you're talking about, and you're just really feeling into that. And that was actually a really pivotal movement for me because I was participating in a 100-day challenge to go and make sure that I did my Tai Chi movement for 100 days for 10 minutes a day. And I kept getting stuck because my hip, it was killing me. Like I would favor one side and I'm just like, I couldn't do it anymore. So I had to do some research. I'm like, okay, I need to know why this is happening and what's going on. So it was one of those things where it forced me to like, okay, I'm going to stop doing this, but I'm going to be proactive in doing yet another thing for myself.
Right. Yeah, the process and the movement seems to connect you with things that need to surface or sort of move out or resolve, if you will. And I would say that takes a lot of courage, because when we have something that like freezes us, or like stops us in our tracks, scares us, it's like, why does that hurt? Where's that coming from? Going back to that idea of like not knowing, about our bodies and how to move our bodies is, I think that there's because of that fear, there's then that tendency to restrict the movement and then not look at it or turn away. So yeah, interesting about your story about going into the movement. And that's why I say like these movements really give you the access to internalizing the mind, and then also allowing you to resolve those things in the body. And I just think about like in my journey, you were talking about how something happens and then the body compensates. So then, that triggers probably a burnout in another area of the body. And we notice there's this like zigzag thing that happens. And then, so when you're going through that process and you're resolving things, it's like, wow, okay, well, I've taken care of that. It's like, oh, but look, now there's this coming up. And so I'm curious to know if like, do you ever see like, okay, there's like a checklist, it's like, or sort of like a goalpost that keeps moving in a way, right? I don't know if you experienced that, but it's like, okay, well, what's going to be next? Or like, what's at the end of this like spiral, or what's at the core? Like what's, if there's any sort of like core injury or something that like, once I get to that, there'll be like optimal, movement and my potential, is reached or something, does that resonate with you at all?
I don't think the journey is ever over, right? It's always going to be something. And I think that a lot of times for us, it's going to we just have to be on top of it and be conscientious of it. I don't know that there is ever like a, resolution moment. But honestly, I'm still pretty new at all this.
Yeah.
And so, I just started I opened my practice in 2019.
Okay.
So it's still, pretty young enough to like not have, seen anything pop up, but I have had some great stories, right? Where people have felt like, wow, you nailed it on the head. I feel so much better. Thank you. And I feel good to have those stories, where people are, they came in for one specific thing. We addressed all of the things that I was seeing that are contributing to it, and they had no idea, I love that aspect of it, where it's like, I came in for my hip, but you helped me with my breath, and you helped me with my my shoulders and my back, and I just feel better, and I can do everything better now.
Are you willing to share, like a story that you've seen, or just something that's really inspired you and just been like, oh my gosh, I'm like contributing, so much, and just so happy. Well, I'm just so happy to be like helping people, because it really just helps you moving forward, and essentially like, getting up every day to like, walk towards your, walk through your journey.
Yeah. I mean, helping is really amazing. And, I think one of the things I really love is the first appointment after we do the assessments with my clients is that I start showing them the stretches and exercises and using foam rollers and lacrosse balls. And a lot of people have those things in their house already, but maybe don't use them in the right way. And we get to the point where they're just making those noises like, oh, or, or the look on their face where it hurts so good, right? Like that's the spot, that this is what I was looking for. And I think that is the great thing where it's going to take a lot of steps, and it's not an easy fix, because it took us years and years and years to get where we're at. So of course it's going to take time and dedication to unwind and unravel. But that is,
I like that metaphor, unwind and unravel.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on something you said earlier about, I think there was two things that I thought about. One was when you mentioned 100 days, that just reminded me, Javi and I look at the 100 days Taoist practice, and Javi's done a few of them. He's had a period in his life where he was really focused on the 100-day mark that's written in the ancient texts, and exploring what that means. And I think our teacher talks, the Chinese really love numbers, and the meaning behind numbers, but the fact that having something go on for so long is basically habit forming, and that connection between needing to do something for beyond a certain length of time. And I think now there's been research on how long it takes to create a new habit, and how long you have to stick with it, and maybe combine that with how long it takes for the body to regenerate new cell patterns and create new neural patterns. And just kind of that, oh, you were doing 100 days too. That was really neat from a different modality. And just my brain going, oh, that's an interesting number that you've brought up, and trying to maybe ask you about why you were engaging in 100-day practice. And then also, seeing the significance that it took you that length of time to really hit that moment where you're like, oh, this is something major that's going on, and I really have to look into it. And the fact that you stepped towards that, you said, I'm going to look into this and move towards the pain and move towards the issue, which is something Javi's been talking a lot about in his pain talks, is that we have to not shy away from those experiences and say, be scared of it and say, oh my gosh, this is happening, and go into doom and gloom or avoidance behavior, or just acceptance that that's the way my body is and that's it. How does one, and maybe how have you come to a place in your life where when something like that happens, you're seeing that as an opportunity, and you've turned it into an opportunity to look more into it, versus someone who might say, oh, well, I have scoliosis and that's just how it is, and I'm just messed up for the rest of my life, or just this is how it is, it's a static thing, or someone who doesn't develop an awareness of it. Like where's that tipping point? And I imagine that if someone were to even be in the pool of becoming your client, they'd have to somehow have that lens that the body has a potential. And how do you get there? How have you gotten there? And do you see any pattern of like people who do appear as your client? Is there some kind of moment where they realize that they can seek help and create change in their life?
That's
that was a lot.
As far as myself, I think it can be hard to do that external look at self, like how did I get to this? But I feel like surgery was never like something I wanted, and that it's really important for self-awareness or self-governance or self-discovery, right? I feel like we've been on this earth for so long, and we interact with this environment. It can't be that we have to have surgery or we have to seek help from someone else. How can we take tools and and use them and grow and be, because it can't be that we were given this body and these things and it's just meant to break down. It just doesn't make sense to me, right? Like we have the tools and we have the ability. So I would say that the clients I see typically are looking for that whole like alternative approach, right? Like how I don't want surgery. I feel like I'm getting older and things are maybe not as don't flow as easily as I'd like them to, or I just can't get rid of this thing in my hip or in my back or my knee or my shoulder. So typically it is people who want an alternative approach and who are willing to do the homework. Like I do want to have a practice, because otherwise it doesn't work without putting in the time and the effort.
And so it does turn into a practice. And Nona was talking about like the habit forming.
Yeah.
There's paradigms in there.
I think that's the hardest challenge, right? Because I can give homework and I can give a brilliant program and here, this will help you change your life, but I can't be at home with someone. I can't make sure they do it. But I also love to give wonderful suggestions. Like for me, my family, after we have dinner, we sit down and we watch a movie together, and I lay on the floor and with my yoga mat and all my little bells and whistles, and I do my stretching and exercise program there, and I just relax. It fits into my life. It's not a sacrifice that I have to do differently than it. It is a part of it, and I think that's important. But then also there's fun things you can do, right, to organize your life a little differently. There's a wonderful movement, biomechanic woman. Her name is Katie Bowman, and she has her dishes like on low shelves in her house, so she has to squat down to get her dishes. Just really implementing movements that are important with everyday life, and just, because you can turn like gardening or picking up your laundry, if you can do that movement well and conscientiously and activate all the right muscles, then you don't necessarily have to have another practice to unwind it.
Yeah, or like a side modality or something, but to integrate. And that's what I love about, the knowledge that I've been given too. It's like, okay, great, I have all this, know all this. How do I fit into my life? How do I integrate it into my everyday life? So that means, like, if there's something that I have to do, or someplace I have to go, or a movement I have to do, it just gives me an opportunity to practice those principles and those postural or movement-based balance, rooting principles and strategies. So what a gift.
Most certainly. Yeah, it is amazing. It's a matter of how you look at everything, right? And how you can incorporate everything. And I think that's important.
I wanted to ask about, kind of bring this back to the center, back to the core.
Okay.
Because, we're talking about like the hip, the mobility, we're talking about extension and abduction, adduction, talked about the limbs. And it's interesting too, because how does that go back into the spine? Do we talk about like motor neurons? Do we talk about the nerves and the nervous system and the feedback system in terms of habit forming and integration of movement and proper movement and alignment? Obviously the spine is central, to that, but there's such a miraculous thing that's going back and forth in terms of like we do a movement or we don't do a movement, and then how we interpret it, how it's interpreted by the whole central nervous system, brain to brainstem into the brain. And essentially, like, the spinal cord is just an extension of the brain.
Right. It's also a storage system, and that's the thing that's kind of interesting, is that the movements get stored at the spinal level. So it is trying to be very efficient with storing its movement. And the thing I think that's pretty interesting is a fun little numbers fact. So in order to learn a new movement, it takes around 350 to 500 repetitions. So like when a kid's learning to ride a bike or play baseball, it's really simple, right? But if you have a faulty movement, where maybe when you're picking something up and you always tend to use your shoulders and your traps.
I totally do that.
Yeah, almost everybody does. To rewrite that and reprogram that movement, it takes around 3,000 to 5,000 repetitions. So it's we have just this deep ingrained neural network. And like I said, our brains want to be efficient. We want to kind of store it away so we can do really complex things by learning small little snippets at a time.
Give us an example. What would that look like?
Well, like say ice skating or like hockey, for instance, right? Like if you can imagine, I can't because I didn't grow up anywhere near it. You're skating on ice, right? You're using a hockey stick. You're defending yourself. So that's a lot of different programs, right? That you have to negotiate. And if you had to learn that every single time you were ice skating or playing hockey, it would be really difficult. But if you can, have all of those little things stored and available to your muscular and nervous system, then it's really easy to keep adding on and building skill within that set of learned behaviors.
So then your awareness and your focus and attention can be all on the puck and the team and the other opponents, and seamlessly you're doing all this negotiation with your body, with your own internal processes, your balance, your alignment, your weight distribution and whatnot. That's what we call regulation, and regulating without regulating. In terms of like, okay, you have a movement. Well, we have the 5 regulations: body, breath, mind, chi, spirit. So when we're given like a movement or a task or something, so we have the breath or the body component or regulation. It's basically the movement. How do you deconstruct that? The breath component or layer or regulation of that, and harmonizing breath with movement, inhalation, exhalation, and then the body, breath, mind, the intention of the movement, and being true to that in terms of like, so the mind, so you're not thinking about your list, but you're pretty much mindful of the movement in the moment. And then that eventually regulates the energy regulation and then the spiritual regulation. But our aim is the regulation of no regulation. So that's like what you're talking about, is like all that hockey player has done all those things. And with martial arts and qigong, it's a similar thing. So that whole cyclical yin yang movement, I always view it as this like polishing sort of mechanism, just to kind of like, because you can't force all that programming into the system. So it's like you have to be relaxed, and you have to like provide the conditions so that it can receive all that information, that data that's coming in, and eventually, you know, go to that harmony and find that, you know, that balance. But yeah, respond to that and go ahead and give us your final thoughts and last words and some advice to people.
I love how you summarized that and brought that all into perspective, because I think that breath is super important, especially when it comes to the central nervous system as well. It is really important for us to regulate and get out of that stress breath. I think that a lot of people do too much mouth breathing, which puts them in a really heightened sympathetic state. And that can set up a lot of issues, right? We get digestive issues from that, because when we get into that sympathetic state, all of the blood rushes to our muscles, and it is just in fight or flight mode. We just want to run away from things. So I think coupling breath with movement and intention is super important for all practices, but just living life. And I really do love to teach, you know, some breath work, because a lot of people, believe it or not, have very unbalanced breathing techniques. A lot of people breathe, have an inverted breathing pattern, which instead of when expanding on inhalation, they draw in their stomach. And I think a lot of that is from the culture of be skinny, look thin all the time. So, you know, we develop this holding pattern of continuously holding our core. And I'm sure in Tai Chi that kind of has its whole own association with the Dantian, like you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to deconstruct a whole tucking in my core and my gut, and I totally had to do that and just let the abdomen, you know, totally expand when I'm inhaling and keep it loose.
Yeah, and I would definitely give that tip to people. The other thing that I think is kind of nice to know is, do you have an anterior pelvic tilt or do you have a posterior pelvic tilt? That can kind of help you. So an easy little test you can kind of give yourself is, you know, when you sit in a chair, how do you sit? Do you sit on the edge of your chair and sit up straight and dump your hips forward? Or do you tend to sit back and
That's me.
round your back and kind of
That's
slouch
me.
into it?
Since I was in school.
Yeah.
So that would be me.
So those things can kind of know, and then that can help you start gauging, like, well, what do I need to pay a little more attention to? If you have anterior pelvic tilt, then you tend to need a little more core strength. If you have a posterior pelvic tilt, you tend to need a little more glute strength. Although glute, I would say it's all integral for everyone to have all of that. You know.
So tell us now where we can find you and how we can find you, make an appointment, and get these tests done.
Okay. Well, I have, I'm on social media, so I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and also on LinkedIn. I have a website. It is align-isc.ptenhance.com, which is a mouthful. You can also email me at align.isc@gmail.com.
That's easy.
Yeah, that's easier. And then you can also contact me at 707-223-2466.
And what's the next class coming up?
I have a mobility class on Mondays and Thursdays. And so that's a great way to get a lot of help and relaxation and just start moving your body. $10 to $20 sliding scale. It's on Mondays at 9 to 10 and Thursdays from 1 to 2.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fun experience, and it's great to connect with you and to talk about body movement and things of the like. And we're going to close it off here. Thanks for listening. And if you want to contact us, talkingchi@gmail.com, talkingqi@gmail.com. And we hope your chi continues to flow smoothly. Remember to engage in your self-care practice and take care. Till next time, thanks again.